All right, we're running a little bit over time, so I think we need now to introduce Professor Damien Coyle. He's going to talk to us about advancing EEG-based assessment of consciousness and cognition in prolonged disorders of consciousness and locked-in syndrome. He's a professor of neurotechnology, UKRI Turing AI Acceleration Fellow, director of the Bath Institute for the Augmented Human at the University of Bath, and professor of neurotechnology at Ulster University. His research develops advanced artificial intelligence methods for decoding electrophysiological signals and translating them into reliable control signals for brain-computer interface systems. His work emphasizes scalable clinical translation, including multi-site trials and real-world deployment with patient populations such as spinal cord injury, stroke, disorders of consciousness, locked-in syndrome, and post-traumatic stress disorder. He's the founder and CEO of NeuroConcise Limited, an award-winning company developing AI-enabled wearable neurotechnology platforms. His presentation will focus on all of the wonderful work that he's been doing. It's been outlined in your program, so you will have read about that. And I think perhaps we'll move straight on to you now, Damien, if you're ready.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for the introduction. I just think my screen there is on widescreen, so I'm just going to change that just very briefly and see if this presents a little bit better. Is that any better now? I think it was on widescreen previously.
I think you still are on widescreen on mine anyway.
Okay, let me see. Sorry about this.
Bauke, can you perhaps make any suggestions?
I right now don't see Damien's screen at all, so I don't really know what suggestions.
Okay.
But here we go.
Yeah, we're onto your screen now.
Still widescreen, is it?
No, you've gone onto your slides. Perfect.
Okay, so get rid of this thing. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. I'm sorry for that delay there. I feel a little bit of pressure now after Howard's talk, which was absolutely excellent. I'd love to talk to you about your Neuralink experience, Howard, at some point. But I'm going to talk to you about detecting hidden awareness in non-responsive patients or people. I'm going to focus on people with disorders of consciousness, but also people with locked-in syndrome. So I think it should be relevant to this topic. So I want to give a little bit of brief background on myself and then a little bit about brain-computer interfaces that involve motor imagery. Then I'll talk about a recent publication we've had where we've used brain-computer interfaces to assess patients with disorders of consciousness and locked-in syndrome. Approximately 42 participants in that study. And then I'll talk a little bit about creating accessible systems and the future of BCIs. So I do a lot of focus on the end user whenever we're developing BCIs. We've done stuff with spinal injury where we enable them to compete in competitions. We've done stuff where we hook BCIs to robotics to facilitate rehabilitation in stroke. We've done things where we enable people to regulate their own brain function to improve cognitive health after PTSD. And this talk, obviously, I'm going to talk about brain injury and disorders of consciousness. So I'm not working on the same kind of level as Neuralink. I look fully non-invasively. So we measure EEG or electroencephalography on the surface of the scalp. And we ask people to imagine movements. And we try to detect modulations in imagined movements and translate that into an action or a communication signal, or we use it to assess awareness. We don't focus on invasive or implantable technology just yet, at least. So motor imagery basics, I'll just kind of cover this briefly. EEG or electroencephalography is a little signal like this that you see on your screen. It's made up of multiple frequencies, so frequencies refer to the speed of the oscillations in the signal. 1 hertz equals 1 sample or 1 cycle per second, 10 hertz equals 10 cycles per second. But when we look at these, we can see different things about a person's mental state or condition. So mu rhythm here is this rhythm here, which is a slow rhythm. It's 8 to 12 hertz. And that's normally active when the motor cortex is at rest. So when you don't do any movement, you see that slow wave. When you see a faster wave, that might indicate that you are doing movement. If you see this on the opposite side to the movement, say if you, for example, you imagine right arm movement, you'll see more of this fast signal on the opposite side of the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is split up like this. So you've got tongue down here, a hand here, and feet right in the center. So it's well defined spatially in terms of where things should be activated whenever we imagine or perform movements. And so we can use that then. So a left arm movement might show activation on the right hand side, right arm movement, left hand side, foot movement in the center. And we know these signals, mu rhythm is for a resting state motor cortex, beta is whenever we activate cortex. We also know that we can train these signals or learn to modulate these signals. Just as a child, when you learn to grasp a toy or develop a skill, you can develop the skill of modulating your own brain activity through imagined movement or motor imagery. And it makes sense to use that type of imagined movement because of the spatial and the differences that I shed. But it also makes sense if we want to try to control something to use movement imagery to do that. So we know all that, but it's still quite challenging to translate these signals into control signals. And I'm not going to talk about any of this, but just to say that we take these squiggly signals, we put them through a lot of algorithms, and we try to produce a signal that looks like this. So it goes up whenever we imagine one type of movement and goes down whenever we imagine another one. So between -1 and 1, basically. And what we try to do then is use that signal to determine which imagined movement the person is performing. And this is normally done in a trial situation where we, a cue to the person at 3 seconds. They imagine the movement according to the arrow, which direction it's pointing, and they do that maybe for approximately 3 to 4 seconds. And that might be lifting a weight with your right arm, or squeezing a brake pedal or a brake on a bike, or some other types of imagery. And so we can also take the continuous control signal then and translate it into something like this. What we try to do is make sure that we measure the accuracy of discriminating between a left and a right movement imagery. And we can do that by looking at what happens when we try to discriminate no movement. And then whenever we perform the movement, in this timed paradigm, what happens then? And what we want to see is an increase from, around 50% accuracy, which is flipping a coin, random accuracy, to greater than 50%, normally greater than 70%. And what I really want to see is that a significant difference between baseline and when we imagine the movement. And that's quite important when we want to establish if the person really is engaging with the technology. And so this is just an example of this in action here. So this is the control signal that I mentioned. This is 32 channels of EEG. The control signal is linked to this game here where the person has to imagine movement to move the character to the left or to the right. And the objective of this game is to collect these spikes as they come up the axons, or these lights coming up these pipes, if you don't know about inside the brain. And the more you do this, the more you get better at it if you're learning from this feedback. And essentially, if you put yes here and no here, you could imagine movement to answer yes or no. That's the kind of concept. Whenever people play these games, we can collect data because we're dictating which movements to imagine, so you can get more data to improve your algorithms. Sorry, I don't know if you can see that, but certainly can everybody see the screen, or just my slides?
We see your slides, and we do see the red dots. If you want.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So with a BCI, it's a learned skill, not simply a matter of mind reading. So there is machine learning and AI involved. There is user training, so it takes a bit of effort. But it also has the application. So what is it that makes somebody actually use this technology? So, in a research context, we're asking people to do it, but what would really drive people to do it long term? And sometimes that is the application, or what benefits that person may get out of it. So we'll just talk about it. One example here where we had a spinal injured person compete in an international competition called Cybathlon. And in this competition, sorry, just one second. What's happened there? Yeah, so the person has to control a race car going down a racetrack in one competition, but at the competition, multiple people with different disabilities compete in various races. One of them is a brain-computer interface race. There's also a functional electrical stimulation bike race. There's prosthetic limb races and so on, and it's held every 4 years. And so in 2024, we had a person compete, and in this race, you had to steer a wheelchair through a virtual environment. You had to move an ice cube cup into an ice cube dispenser. You had to put a key in a keyhole, and you had to do a menu selection. And so the person had to sit in front of the computer and imagine movements to do various tasks to achieve these targets. So very, very difficult. But what we showed was that improvement occurred over time for this individual. So by more engagement in the earlier competitions and then in the later competitions, and you don't really have to understand these graphs, but just to know that this person was able to get better at modulating their brain activity over time, and that's shown by the trend words upwards, and we did quite well in one or two of those competitions. And so this really had an impact on this individual. He was able to get out of the country and go and compete internationally. So, his application, his inspiration or motivation was to win this competition or do as best as he can. And that made him more engaged in the technology, even though sometimes it's quite challenging to use. So I just wanted to emphasize that, with repeated effort, you can get better at this. So I'm going to talk about the main topic that I wanted to talk about today, which is assessing awareness and disorders of consciousness. And so we know that prolonged disorders of consciousness is a condition in which a person cannot move to communicate, and in some cases may be considered completely unaware. So a coma state is where a person is completely unaware and has no awareness and no arousal. Unresponsive wakefulness syndrome is where the person seems to be aroused but has absolutely no awareness. And then minimally conscious state is where there is arousal and awareness, but it's very difficult to detect and sometimes fluctuates. And with locked-in syndrome, then we assume you still cannot communicate, perhaps without technology, but you have full awareness of state. So sometimes it's very difficult to detect whether somebody is either minimally conscious or locked in because they cannot respond overtly to commands, and that can be quite challenging. So what we've set out to do is to try and establish better ways of doing that. Standard methods for doing that are to use behavioral skills, so skills that look at different types of functions, and these skills really depend on whether a person can respond overtly to the command. And if they're not able to respond with movement or eye blinks or some other mechanisms, then that person may be assumed to be unaware, even though they have awareness and are unable to move. So the clinical challenge is that some patients retain awareness despite appearing unresponsive. Severe motor impairment prevents communication. Standard assessments rely on observable behavior, and sometimes that can be subjective or require very prolonged assessments. And therefore, hidden awareness may therefore go undetected. And there is an indication that up to 40% of people in the minimally conscious state may be misdiagnosed as maybe UWS or worse. And so in disorders of consciousness spectrum, we have, UWS or what used to be called vegetative state. Awareness is uncertain, ability to respond is absent. In MCS, awareness is partial, ability to respond is inconsistent. In LIS, awareness is preserved, but sometimes ability to respond is severely restricted. And then healthy is obviously normal. Can we detect awareness directly from brain activity rather than movement? So that was our big question. And so what we've been doing is, to ask people to learn to imagine movements and then determine if the brain-computer interface can distinctly detect which movement the person is imagining. So in this scenario, no physical movement is required. And so what we've done is move beyond. We weren't the first people to say, right, do this type of brain-computer interface. There was original studies. Often those original studies focus on single assessments, so one session in which people are asked to do this, and then it's established whether they can distinguish between left and right. And if that assessment showed that there was no engagement, then it might have been indicating that this person wasn't able to imagine movement, or that this person was unresponsive and maybe in a UWS state. So what we've said is what we do in standard motor imagery trials with other participants: do repeated assessments, enable training with feedback, and then move on to some kind of progressive questioning. And our hypothesis is how awareness signals can strengthen through learning and repeated engagement in prolonged disorders of consciousness, as well as what we've shown on other areas, such as the spinal injury person I mentioned earlier competing in Cibathlon. So we developed this multi-stage or multi-session framework where we have initial assessments. So we ask people to imagine movements and then detect if we can discriminate. If we see we can detect some differences, then they'd move on to stage 2, in which we do multiple sessions where we give real-time feedback, and that helps the person to train. And then after 6 or 7 sessions, we move on to a question and answering assessment that allows us to kind of determine, on average, how well somebody can respond to different types of questions. And so the initial assessment may start like this. Every time you hear a beep, imagine that you're lifting your right or left hand. And then we'll do that maybe 30 beeps or 15 beeps in a row, and then we'll take a little break. And then the next block will be every time you hear a beep, try to imagine that you're lifting both feet. And then we'll do that over a number of blocks and assess the responses after that. So training awareness signals, learning to control brain activity can be quite challenging, even for able-bodied, healthy participants. And so you need this kind of repeated practice, as I said. And some participants learn to generate clear responses over time. So it's similar to learning a new skill. You can learn from the feedback, and that's quite important. Now, feedback in our situation was given through auditory feedback. I've shown there earlier visual feedback in the form of that game, but sometimes participants with disorders of consciousness close their eyes during the sessions, or sometimes we find it difficult to determine how well they can actually see. So using visual feedback doesn't work. So with auditory feedback, we're moving sounds from left to right. And when you imagine left arm movement, you hear the sound going this way. Imagine right arm movement, you hear that sound going towards your right ear. And we start with pink noise, which is easy to localize in space. So it's like an old broken TV, not very nice to listen to, but it enables us to hear very well where the sound is. And then we move on to musical feedback to make it a little bit more interesting. And we do the same time paradigm, for about 3 or 4 seconds, they imagine left arm or feet movement and right. And then we do that over 60 trials and assess the performance after that. And so the idea is that we have this closed loop kind of scenario: patient imagine movement, BCI detects the signal, audio feedback is provided, then the patient refines their strategy, and hopefully the signals become stronger and we're able to distinguish them more reliably then across sessions. And so after they've done this over a number of sessions and may have improved, but at least may have got a really good understanding of what the technology might enable them to do, we ask them to participate in question answering. And so we've set it up so we have different types of questions where we've got them broken down into biographical awareness, situational awareness, abstract reasoning, numbers and letters. And we basically say, to answer yes, imagine left arm movement, or to imagine no, imagine feet movement. And we basically sit down with the family member, make sure we have the correct yes, no responses for the questions. We ask the family member to read the questions aloud, so then we can record the family member speaking. And then the questions are played back in a familiar voice to the participant multiple times over a number of sessions, and they have to respond appropriately within those. So there's no open questions in this. It's a closed question scenario. We don't look at individual answers specifically. We're just looking at how well they respond. Can they get above chance level accuracies in saying yes or no to the group of questions? And then is there any differences across the different types of questions? And so again, that follows the same kind of trial-based protocol where you've got question and then a few seconds to respond, and then another question and a few seconds to respond. So we had 42 participants in this study, aged 17 to 73 years old, multiple NHS sites, and as well as that Irish-based clinical sites. We recruited from the PDOC and LIST populations. And we designed this for real-world clinical deployment. So we didn't restrict the environment. We went to patients' homes, we went to hospitals, we went to care homes, wherever the patient was, we went, all over the UK and Ireland. And I think Naomi's on the call, one of our trials managers, who did a lot of this very difficult, traveling around the country, going to these sites. So what we found was that reliable brain responses were common. 31 of the 42 participants showed reliable intentional modulation of brain activity. 90% of these progressed to yes, no question, and brain responses became increasingly consistent across sessions for some participants. Sorry, somebody's just started a lawnmower here. 1 second. Sorry about that. So this is kind of the summary. We had 42 patients recruited, 14 UWS, 17 MCS, 11 LIS. 31 of those patients made it through to the neurofeedback sessions. And so that was 8 people out of 14 with UWS. And remember, UWS is where you're assumed to be completely unaware of your surroundings and unable to respond. 13 of the MCS and obviously 10 of the 11 LAS. And then for one reason or another, some of those patients didn't progress to questioning. That had been due to delays or not, illness or whatever. But 6 of the 8 went to UWS went to question and answering, and 12 of the 13 MCS. Okay, so what we found was that whenever we combine, or BCIs did provide an indication that allows discriminate between the different groups, between UWS, MCS, and LAS. But when we combine this with the standard assessments, behavioral assessments, so Coma Recovery Scale Revised and West Extent Index measurement, and that ensemble, we could actually improve our ability to distinguish the different types of groups. So BCIs added value in terms of being able to distinguish between UWS, MCS, and LAS. So for diagnostic purposes, this could be potentially beneficial. And what we showed was that there is little difference between MCS and UWS, but that LAS is significantly better than MCS or UWS, and there is differences between LAS and MCS across the groups. So certainly LAS has much better potential to use these types of technologies than people with the more in disorders of consciousness conditions. But the results showed that MCS was often closer to LAS than UWS. When we look at the question and answer sessions, we can see that LAS responded much better to question and answers than UWS or MCS, but we're still seeing that UWS and MCS achieved up to 70% accuracy in significant runs. We also showed that some participants responded differently to different types of questions. Now, this is still early stages, but this could indicate that you may be able to assess different types of awareness with this technology, in terms of whether they have more biographical awareness or logical or situational awareness. Again, these are very early stage results, and we can't say that for certain, but certainly there was variations in performance across different types of question categories for some subjects. So just in summary, that's kind of where we're at with this. This is kind of an illustration, and shows that with standard clinical assessments and require behavioral measurements, there is often a distinguishable pattern in terms of response, and this indicates that where movement is available, then people can respond and therefore can respond to these behavioral assessments. But it also might mean that based on the BCI responses, that even the people in UWS who may not be able to respond overtly with imagined or with physical movement, still were able to achieve above chance level accuracies with the BCI. So certainly there's indications that BCI is adding value there to diagnosis potential. And so we often see then, even in this scenario here, where the training, feedback, and Q&A, You have MCS or UWS performing slightly better on the Q&A than MCS, and LAS showing clearly improved results compared to the DOC groups in that situation. We also showed some interesting findings in which, the brain response and the functional connectivity between the brain areas is very much different between UWS and MCS and UWS and LAS, but less so between LAS and MCS. So the closeness in terms of functionality between MCS and LAS might indicate that people diagnosed with MCS just have limited capacity to respond, and therefore, could be misdiagnosed and actually in an LAS locked-in syndrome condition. We also showed that, over time, behavioral or functional areas started to kind of get more focalized in different groups. So even in this person, UWS, we kind of had widespread activity, during initial sessions. And as time progressed, it started to become more focal around motor areas, which is what we would expect when we're trying to engage focal areas. Able-bodied show this kind of area activated all the time from start to beginning. MCS again showing gradual improvement towards more focal areas. As I mentioned before, some participants gotten better over time. So this is an MCS participant. You can see that over multiple runs with different types of feedback, this is 10 sessions with multiple different runs in each session. Improvement happened over time. So again, this indicates a learning curve. We've also done things with combined motor imagery and auditory oddball paradigm. And in this situation, stimuli or auditory stimuli are presented to the individual. And for the oddball stimulus, you get a response like this called the deviant or novel response. So it's like a P300, a response that occurs 300 milliseconds after the person hears that stimulus. That doesn't occur for the other stimuli that are standard. And when we look at this compared to motor imagery, you can see that for the N1 latency, it actually, this is how long it takes to get this response. It's much longer in UWS than it is in LAS. And whereas also motor imagery performance in UWS is much lower than it is in LAS. So you expect this kind of negative correlation between the two measures, which we've observed on a small subset of participants. And so we've been working on this for quite a while now, and we've got some participants that have been there at the start, and they've participated in some kind of interviews with the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and their families really want to engage in this technology and help their loved ones to try and develop communication strategies, but also therapeutic benefits just from engaging the brain when doing these types of tasks. And we've got over 15 hospitals involved in this study right across the UK and Ireland, and we're still continuing with the study for another year using lower cost technologies, which I'm going to talk about in a second. There's a lot of challenges with brain-computer interfaces that measure signals non-invasively. Fatigue, mood, stress, anxiety, and other things can affect the brain response, and this can make it very challenging to produce reliable BCI outputs when we look at, let's say, the brain from the outside. There's also this human machine learning dilemma where we have to adapt the BCI to the person's brain activity initially, then the person learns to modulate their brain activity differently through the feedback, and then we have to retrain the BCI. And so this is a mutual learning co-adaptation between the two, the human and the machine, basically. And then we've been doing here that I've shown you 10 sessions. Whenever you were a child learning to grasp a toy, how long did that take? Weeks, months. We're doing 10 1-hour sessions, and we're expecting people to learn to modulate their own brain activity to control something or do something. So we need to get more sessions and more engagement and more intensity, I think, to really get to a point where we can see the utility of these technologies. Also, like a negative response, I mentioned some participants didn't make it from stage 1 to stage 2. That may not have been because they were, unaware or completely on a UWS situation. It may have been due to illness or, sometimes when we have movements or uncontrollable movements, you get noise in the data. And there's different times, different periods in which we do the assessments, and that might not be the best period for that particular individual. So I wouldn't say that those people didn't have awareness, and there is still a little bit of uncertainty around the technologies and how they can be deployed, and trying to get the right time of day for an individual or otherwise. So this is technology like this is not necessarily saying not movement does not necessarily mean not aware. And so using BCIs in conjunction with standard behavioral measures could add additional kind of value in diagnostic situations. And for some patients, MIBCI may provide a route towards basic yes/no communication. So why neurotechnology is not mainstream? So there's key barriers such as small data sizes. We're still looking at very small data in all of neurotechnology. Tens to 20s of sessions. Tens to 20s of users. We would like to scale this to much larger user groups, much longer intensive programs. And what we've been trying to do is to try to make technologies available to do that. See if we can get this to go. And so what we want to try to make is wearable technologies connected to tablets and smartphones, and that can be deployed anywhere: hospitals, rehabilitation units, care homes, or patients' homes. Neuroconcise, a company that I've founded, spun out from Ulster University, has tried to do this by creating wearable headsets that are, very cost effective, concealed in standard headgear. They have a flexible form factor that folds around the head, so you don't have to look unusual when you're using it. Cloud connected and collected to smartphones. This is kind of how it looks here whenever we've put it on. We've got interesting electrodes that allow you to kind of get the electrode through the hair, use it dry potentially, but also allow you to put in a minimum amount of gel through the legs and channels. And so that's what it looks like. You've got a headset completely wireless. Looks a little bit like a swimming cap. We have baseball caps now as well. And then this compares to other technologies that are similar, wearable and very good, but just different form factors. As I said, we want to break down barriers. We're taking these technologies from lab-based solutions right through to multi-users, scalable, independent deployment in the home, and we're getting very close to being able to do that. So from today it's detecting awareness, tomorrow maybe reliable yes/no responses, and then future communication systems, personalized rehabilitation, and even continuous monitoring of recovery could be enabled through this type of technology. So key take-home messages: hidden awareness can be revealed. A structured multi-session BCI approach combining training, neurofeedback, and staged questions may be able to detect intentional brain activity, improve awareness detection, operates in clinical environments, creates a pathway towards communication for patients unable to speak or move. And the critical advance is not simply detecting awareness once, it is strengthening and confirming awareness over time. So the UK is preparing for these types of technologies, and there is lots of interesting reports around neurotechnology, which would encourage people to read. That's why we've set up the Bath Institute for the Augmented Human, where we don't only focus on neurotechnology or only focus on health, but looking at ways to improve the human condition through various numbers of technologies and integration of those technologies. And we don't only focus on lab-based research. We try to figure out exactly what is the end user requirement, and then develop the pathways to impact and support trials and regulatory and spin-outs or licensing of these types of technologies in a way that's kind of maximizing the potential to have an impact on the targeted end users. We have an independent home study ongoing, and we're currently recruiting for that, where we're going to deliver those neuroconcise headsets to people in their home to play games for 20 hours over 1 month. So we're hoping to do 25 people per month, every month for 12 months. So if you're interested in participating in that study, please do get in touch. Thanks to everybody who's supported this and all the funders. There's too many to mention individually. And thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. And sorry if I've run over there a little bit.
That was wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Damien. Do people have questions? You're getting lots and lots of cheers and claps.
Thank you, everyone.
We have a raised hand from David.
Yeah, I was
Hello,
just
David.
to ask about a question in your presentation. There's a difference in the consciousness between locked-in syndrome and normal consciousness with the phrase, and I just wondered how you would define that.
Well, sorry, so, like, apologies if I don't use the right terminology.
No, it's absolutely fine. I don't mind.
But I suppose what we've seen is that locked-in syndrome, haven't got very much differences in terms of consciousness or awareness compared to normal. It's just more difficult to communicate that.
Yeah,
and
okay.
Sometimes sometimes that can be difficult, and so difficult to communicate that a person may be, classified or diagnosed as minimally conscious, even though they're locked in. So the spectrum there is quite difficult. Some people who are locked in have really good control of their eye movement and can use eye trackers and can do reliable eye blinks and various other things when they're being assessed. Whereas somebody with other kinds of brain injuries, maybe cognitively intact, but just have this kind of motor disassociation, which is quite challenging to enable them to use their movement capacity, and that's kind of the difference. But yeah, I would say, obviously we've seen from Howard earlier, he's fully conscious, fully aware, a very intelligent human being, and there's lots of people in locked-in syndrome like that.
Thank you.
We have another question, Fernando.
Yeah, well, just to underline what David was saying, locked-in syndrome is not a disorder of consciousness. It's put there because of other reasons that don't have to do with affected consciousness. But my question goes in a different direction. I know, Damien, that it's not your field, but when you think about bioethical or ethical consequences of the kind of technology that you are studied and that you presented so usefully and clearly, do you see a difference between, let's say, that we're able to identify different types of memory? Would one draw different ethical conclusions about the patients, about care, and so on? Or you see it more as a, all or none thing, as soon as you detect some kind of covert awareness, then all the bioethical consequences or the ethical consequences are the same, regardless of the degree of consciousness or kind of consciousness or awareness that you are able to detect through the technology.
Yeah, I suppose that's probably important to say that we're working on basic science. So anything that we detect or any conclusions that we draw are not supposed to change care pathways or opinions about the patient, because we're still in this research phase. We're evaluating the technology. We're trying to determine accuracies and so on, and we still need to do a lot more for that. But if you could determine reliably that somebody has more situational awareness than biographical awareness, that might help with some kinds of care or understanding the patient better. And with these types of technologies, they raise all kinds of ethical concerns around care and so on. And we have to make sure that any changes that we make, we're fully confident that that is correct. And so making sure that you've got all the indications of accuracy, your confidence in that accuracy. And that's why we do quite a lot of very detailed statistical tests to make sure that the responses that we're seeing are above chance and significantly above chance. But again, we're sitting at around 70%, or 70 above, which is kind of a criterion level for 2-class BCIs. But at 70%, you still have 30% error, right? So so there's difficulties there. So answering a specific question, could be quite difficult. But when we look at averaging over multiple repetitions of the same types of questions and getting an average, you can start to look at maybe the different types of capacities and so on. So I hope that kind of answers your question a bit. In terms of ethics around privacy and mental privacy, there's loads of things about neurotechnology in general that need to be really taken care of for these technologies to be placed on anybody's head for longer term. People have to be fully consenting, as well, in terms of, do they want these technologies to be used? And just going back, like I'm we've in the slide there earlier, like we say disorders of consciousness and locked-in syndrome. So we're not putting locked-in syndrome in the disorders of consciousness category. And it's just this study we kind of focused on establishing awareness in disorders of consciousness, but LAS, is part of the kind of the benchmark for what we're trying to analyze and assess.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, for your question.
We have another question from Helen.
Hi, Damien. That was really fascinating presentation. Thanks a million. I'm sitting here in County Down listening to you, so I'm
all right.
Not a million miles away from Ulster University, and I also work in Cambridge, so I'm in the specialised AAC service based over there. I know that we certainly have quite a few service users who access my service for more standard AAC, who would be really interested in talking to you or taking part in that at-home study. So if you're okay with that, I'll share the email address that you had on your slide there. I just had a question in relation to kind of augmentative and alternative communication. So you mentioned there about kind of you envisage it moving forward from the kind of yes/no response stages to a more, maybe looking more like control over a standard communication aid system. And I just wondered, like, how far off, in your opinion, do you think the technology is from reaching that point?
Well, like we've got people, that control, the game in a two-dimensional control. We've got people that we're doing stuff in the lab where we're trying to decode three-dimensional movements when people point in different directions. But it is very, very challenging. And even the people that are hitting 80-90% sometimes drop to 70. So you've got this challenge with the non-stationary nature of the brain and the fluctuating performance. So it's stability that's the challenge a lot of the time. And then trying to control that. Neuralink and other implantable technologies don't have the same interference that we do when we measure brain activity non-invasively. You've got lots of background brain activity, you've got environmental noise, so that can cause challenges. And so whilst somebody could use it for therapeutic benefit and learn to modulate their brain activity and control. And potentially, if we got really reliable, left versus right distinction, we could use yes/no responses, and you can break that down then into doing more kind of splitting up the alphabet or some useful AICC mechanisms where you just have binary control to get to your end response. I still think there's a bit to do there in terms of just making sure that the performance is reliable enough to do that. But as I say, 10 sessions is very limited in any learning task, especially this. So we're trying to create these technologies so people can engage with it independently in the home as long as they want. And there is motivational ways to kind of keep people interacting with that. So yeah, it's still quite challenging. There are technologies that work on different responses to brain-computer interface or motor imagery responses, where you have P300 spellers, for example, where the person just has to focus on different flashing stimuli and an alphabetical kind of layout, and they've been shown to be reasonably good for communication in locked-in syndrome and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Or motor neuron disease, but again, they require eye movement, control, and can be quite challenging. Again, with non-stationary variations in performance. So we're working on lots of stuff in the lab that's trying to improve this, looking at better AI, better stability, and we're hopeful that can be produce better technologies. Trying to get technologies into the home and people using them independently will also produce more data that will allow us to assess time of day, other types of states and traits of the user. So you can kind of combine multimodal data to figure out, you know, what types of algorithms work better in the morning for this individual compared to the evening. And so there's a lot to do in terms of just looking at improving, you know, an understanding of where fluctuations occur in that user's performance on a day-to-day basis, and trying to develop tools and techniques to counteract that. So going back to your question. Sorry, go ahead, Shan. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to post up details about your home study on the website and on the locked-in syndrome forum. So hopefully we'll get people in touch with you for that.
Could I just say one thing about that? So the home study is for able-bodied healthy participants, just to look at the usability of the technology. Okay. But we are still recruiting on our PDOC study and LAS study. So Naomi's there. So we've got, and we would go to participants' homes with that lower cost technology as well. So certainly be keen to hear from anybody that's interested. Sorry, Shannon, I know.
Thank you.
We've got one. Thank you, Helen. We've got one more question. If you can make it a bit brief, Hannah, because we're now running 25 minutes late. But let's go to Hannah. Barker, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, I'm not sure if Hannah can speak, so I can also read the question out loud from the chats.
Thank you.
So Hannah says, neurotechnology does not have the ambition to make the person's own muscles to work with the command sent by the brain and identified by your capture, like building a detour to replace the role of the brain stem as a bridge from the brain to the muscles.
Yes, certainly. Like we're aiming to create a movement independent response. So you don't need to be able to control your muscles to be able to use a BCI. That is the main thing about BCIs. Like, you know, if you've got movement, then BCI mightn't add much value, you know, but if you've got no movement, BCIs may be the only option, and that's what we're working towards.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you for your question, Hannah. I had a whole list of questions for you, Damien, but you've gone through everything gradually through the slides. You covered everything that I was going to ask. I'm just delighted that something that's going to be a more affordable diagnostic tool is on its way, particularly for countries that have very little funding in their healthcare systems. It's just going to be a real game changer, stupid word, but a real game changer. Thank you so much for the work you're putting in for that.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks, everyone.
Been lovely having you with us. Thank you.